Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jock Reynolds, the director of the Yale University Art Gallery, and I want to thank all of you for coming from far and wide today to pay honor to someone we all love and hold dear in our hearts, Richard "Chip" Benson. We're going to begin this program with a wonderful video. It involves a steam engine, and it's a video produced by Frank Cantor. We'll end with some video clips. In the meantime, we'll have a wonderful series of speakers who've known this wonderful man in many capacities, so we will start now with the first video.
I didn't put a leader in it that I should have. See, the cylinder is still cold. See, it's hitting water. It takes a long time to get everything hot. We haven't even done the pump yet. The pump is very hard to start. Very hard to get. Oh, that's not so good. Wait a minute, that's bad. Now, how good is this guy? I mean, really, I ask you. This is a beautiful, beautiful engine. It's pretty good, isn't it?
I was going to thank Jock for asking me to go first so I didn't have to worry about crying afterwards that I forgot about the video, so it starts early. Hi, my name's Abby Benson. I'm the third of Chip's 4 kids, Barbara and Chip, and I'm really pleased to be here today, and it's really just amazing to see the crowd here and so many familiar faces. I want to thank Jock Reynolds and the Art Gallery and Dean Kuzma and the School of Art for putting this event on. Ooh, it's tough. Sorry. Okay, I want to talk about Yale, actually, because Yale was a really large and distant presence in our lives for years and years. Not only because it was the one place where my father would disappear to once a week. We didn't really know where he was going, this place, this phantom place, Yale. But also it was the chance to provide, a paycheck and health insurance, and something that allowed my father to live this simultaneous life as an artist and a family man. And one of the tremendous themes I've kept hearing over the last few months is students and family members who are artists saying, I didn't think I could have all of that until I met your father. And he explained that you can be an artist and you can have a family, it can all coexist. And I think Yale made that possible in a lot of ways. Let's see, I started coming to Yale when I was younger. He would pick one of his kids to come a couple of times a year. We would hang out in the basement of the A&A building. It smelled like home, like a dark room. And that's really what I thought Yale was, basically a smelly basement. And I was still fascinated by it because it was full of the most amazing people and spaces that I'd ever seen. And then periodically the students would come to Newport and they'd see my dad shop and they'd see him in action. And as I got older, after the big lobster feast that my mother would put on, they would sit on the patio and there was a lot of drinking and smoking involved and discussions, and I got to sit with the students and hear what they had to say and see my father interact with them and realize that the love that he had for me, he basically showered on everyone. So when I decided I wanted to go to college, Yale was high on my list. Once my parents were convinced my grades could make it work, they said, yes, go ahead, apply. And I ended up coming here as an undergraduate. And I had dinner once a week with my dad, always Thai food, always yellow curry, often with Todd, often with John Gamble, often with a lot of people that are here in this room. And it was the most tremendous time because I had one night a week for 4 years with my father to myself, and I got to talk about what I was studying and what I was learning and where I wanted to be and where I wanted to go. And I probably had the only Yale parents on the planet that when I came to Yale, they said, don't focus too much, take everything. You know, use it as a time to take sociology or geology, art, whatever you want to do. And I remember sheepishly telling my dad at the end of my freshman year that I'd fallen in love with two things. Rocks, I took a geology class, and rowing. Two things that are pretty far from the family dynamic. And that I was going to spend the rest of my time at Yale catching up on all my science classes so I could get a geology major, and rowing for 3 hours every morning and often 3 hours every evening. And he couldn't have been more supportive. And that theme of support continued throughout my life. When I made other crazy decisions like joining the military and moving to the mountains far away from the ocean, and ultimately going into higher education administration, which many of you probably know that that's one of the things my father really kind of railed against for many years was higher education administration. So I don't mean to offend anyone in the room, but it's true. So when he was asked to become dean, it was almost laughable because he'd avoided that part of his life for his whole career. But I think he knew, and we knew, and you all knew, that he would be really uniquely qualified to bring the School of Art into this digital age and to bring the building to life and to talk with equal amounts of kindness and humility and passion with the faculty and the donors and the electricians and the plumbers to get it all done. And I think he did get it done really beautifully. So I guess I just want to finish by saying that ability is the thing about my father that I admire the most. It's the thing I try to emulate the most in my life. And it's just really an amazing thing that, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just reserved for us. It was really something that he dosed out in equal parts to all of you. And I hope that that's part of his legacy that lives on, that all of us will be that way and carry on the legacy of my dad. So he really loved a good story, the same story over and over. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all the stories today, both during the program and also afterwards. And I can't finish without just saying to my mother, I see her there, you obviously are an equal part of this whole package, and I think my father would not have been the man he was without you constantly supporting him. So I'm sorry for your loss, too. So, okay, thanks.
I actually wrote a piece of paper for this because I knew Abby would do a great job. So I'll try to stick to this because Jock has only given me 1 minute. And Jock, I wanted to say my dad would never live within 1 minute. So to those that don't know me, my name is Daniel. I am the fourth, and I would like to say probably the most difficult child my mom and dad had. I'm still thinking there's time. Who knows? But it might come as a surprise that I call my dad Chip. And I wanted to talk about that because it is a part of Dad's life. In Newport, Dad was Chip. And the second he left Newport, he was Richard. And there were two different lives. He lived, as Abby mentioned, he would go away. And we never knew what he was doing down there. And everybody that we met through the years was like, who's this Chip guy? And he was down here, he was Richard. In New York, he was Richard. Everywhere else, he was Richard. But in Newport, he was Chip. And that was a very interesting thing for a family to learn early on, that you can kind of have two lives, if you will, as Abby mentioned. Dad's time at Yale had a lasting impression on him, and it certainly did on Abby, myself, our brother Luke, and Sarah, and Dory, my wife, and all of our kids. Yale is part of us. Frequently, as Abby mentioned, I would be brought to Yale on overnight trips, only to be left in good old B-19. Who remembers B-19? Yeah. As Abby mentioned, B-19 was basically the last place anybody wanted to be. It was basically where Yale allowed the photography department to be. It was in the basement of the A&A building, and you just don't want to be there. I bet nobody's allowed there anymore. Dad would bring me down, and Mom would say, get him out of the house. And Dad would put me in B-19 with a box of Legos, and he was hoping he could get a few hours out of me. And before he knew it, I'd be sitting at the top of the stairs in B-19 listening to Dad talk with Todd and all of the other students and listening to them interact, which was amazing. We're talking about 7 years old watching this interaction. Most of us at that age are going to school. We learn a different side of school where you're just talked to and you're said to go study this and go do this. They don't really want to hear from you. But what I learned at a very early age was very different. And I think Todd and Dad really invented this world that was substantial. Please bear with me when I read this here. I'll lose my train of thought if I don't. I watched your teachers, students, push you in ways that you did not know you could be pushed. They knew you were limiting yourself in many ways, and they knew that they could talk you out of those limits. And only they knew that. And Greg and John and everybody is still carrying that on. And watching that again at a young age was something very different. And Dad did that to all of us. He would look you in the eye and tell you what you were doing wrong. And he would tell you why you were doing it wrong and how you had to stop it. And he learned that from Todd. This was something Dad learned over the years. There's no holding back. And one of the things I would say is that they guided you. They didn't try to change you. And that's very important as teachers come and go. A lot of teachers just want you to be a mirror of themselves. These guys, not the case. Watching Todd and Dad and so many more over those years in the late 80s, Yale had an effect on me which I respected and I reflect upon every day. And I will always look back and be thankful for those times where Mom couldn't bear me another minute to send me down to Yale. In those years, unknowingly, I became close friends with many students. Most of you were in this room, and who would have thought at the age of 8 this crazy kid would get to be friends with Yale grad art students, right? To this day, I'm still friends with many of you, and that is something that I'm thankful to Yale for and thankful to my dad for. It's a very unique thing to have an opportunity to get that friendship. Later, Todd suggested that Dad be considered for the deanship, immediately putting then Todd's employee in a position to be Todd's boss. Todd didn't blink an eye when he suggested it, and it shows what this group was made of. It really is something, that to have your direct report suggest or be suggested for a position to immediately become your boss is quite something, Todd, and I've always looked at you in a way that is credible, and that's something Dad would have done as well. Many interviews later and months, Dad and I were working on the Albert Watson Cyclops book, and you might not know it, but the prospect of the deanship was a very hard time in our lives. It was this huge change for Mom and Dad, and it was very stressful. It was this balancing act of, could we get this job? What would happen if we got this job? What about all the other jobs that we have, right? And that was stressful. And it required a move and his major support system, which is Mom, as Abby mentioned. Without Mom, my dad would be still, in some room printing on a printing press, which he probably would have been happy with. But Mom really, Mom made it happen. The entire family was stressed beyond belief, and the unknown was starting to wear on us. So one day, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone. For some reason, I was the guy that picked up this phone call. And I heard this very delightful young lady on the phone say, "Greetings. This is a call for Richard Benson from the president of Yale University." And I looked at my dad, and I laughed, and I said, "Oh, hello. Let me see if I can catch him." And all of you know that Dad was very hard to catch. And if he didn't want to talk on the phone, he just wasn't going to talk on the phone. So I looked over at my dad, and there he was, whistling to some song that I've heard way too many times. We had 3 drum scanners, a bunch of Macs, and a bunch of SunSpark stations buzzing away. This is at the very beginning of digital direct-to-film. It's a pretty big time. And I looked at Dad, and I said, "Dad, you don't even want to know who's on this phone." And I handed him the phone. And it was them offering Dad the job at Yale as the dean. The deanship in many ways was like any other project of my father's. He took it head on and solely. He had nothing else to do but that job when he did that job. Nothing else was to happen. It was going to be all he did for a period of time he allotted, in this case 10 years. And in that time, he and his amazing team tackled the new building. Stacy and Brian and Barbara, always doing their best for Dad, always eager to watch in astonishment his drive and ability to accomplish, something everyone that knew him envied. This will be the hardest part of this talk for me. I will leave you with it, my view on my dad's life. When I knew him from 77 to 2017, it was purely amazing. And I really early on realized that my dad was a different guy. Sorry. His wife was harder and stronger than he was, and as a team, nothing could stop them. All of his children did what they were going to do in their lives, and Mom and Dad never tried to change that. We witnessed daily what most of you in this room would drive and fly from far and near to get an hour of. And let's face it, if you were lucky, you'd get that hour before you got shooed out the door. Because of this, I would like to say to all of you that I'm sorry for your loss, because we all share this loss. I personally do not regret a minute that I had with my dad. I had more time with my dad than anybody. And in the end, he unknowingly became my best friend. And I will always be happy for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jock, for arranging all of this. And thank you, Abby and Daniel, for those memories. A lot of it was news to me, very moving news. I'm going to read something, and it's more than the allotted time. Richard Benson and I, who was never Chip to me, but always Richard, worked together at Yale for about 35 years after he joined the faculty in the Department of Photography in 1979. He often said I was his boss for the years he taught and that he was mine during his tenure as Dean of the School of Art. Although we agreed that our working relationship was more bad cop, good cop than anything else. I don't think I have to tell you who was which. As I grappled with writing this, a little movie kept running through my head. Richard's standing on the porch of my house here in New Haven, squinting through a side window, after ringing the bell as if willing me to get to the door before he bursts into 1,000 chips from having to wait a few seconds. My problem with this is that I have to maneuver around Truffle, our poodle, who's madly barking and spinning in violent circles in the small foyer leading to the door, desperate for me to open it and let Richard in. because he knows the first thing his big friend will do is lift him up, all 35 pounds of his doggy self, and carry him into the house, nuzzling him and murmuring, "Oh, Doggus," into his long ear. Remember, this is the man who wrote an extended, sweethearted essay called Me and Moke, an analysis of how genetically close, while simultaneously distant, he, Richard, and Moke, his beloved Samoyed, were to each other. Once he puts Truffy down, he greets and kisses Deborah, my wife, paces into the kitchen and asks for coffee, but skeptically, because I make it with an Italian espresso machine. A European wrinkle he distrusts. Always forthright, though, he finally concedes after a second cup that it's good, isn't it? Even as both of us know he'll go through the same rigmarole the next time he visits. Then we talk, conversations that usually consist of Richard dispensing advice in a fine frenzy rolling, confident in what he has to say from first to last. Over the years, these talks have covered everything. For example, around the subject of real estate, which house to buy or not, where to put the darkroom in the house we do buy, not in the cellar, and even how long we should allow our son to continue to live in that house once he's graduated from college. Not long. I think he considered himself an expert on this subject since he'd bought a neighbor's house in Newport years before and had it moved and joined to his own house in such a way that he could walk directly from the family kitchen into his new studio and not have to leave his wife Barbara during the day. Barbara, who allowed him to straddle with natural ease what artists often find to be the intractable contradiction between loving and art that Yeats described as the perfection of the life or of the work, and who for 50 years they were together, he called his bride. Let me note, too, that Richard washed all of the dinner dishes through those years, often for a family of 6, although he'd wait until morning as dawn cracked to get up to the sink to do it. Anyway, back at our house, the talk really churns once Richard asks for a piece of paper or grabs a napkin and starts drawing or charting the best way for me to solve this or that photographic problem I've asked him about, one typically having to do with reproducing my pictures in ink. His mind churns as the solution he's proposing takes its sure, emphatic shape, step by step. Having Richard Benson at hand, offering his knowledge in response to such questions is, for me at least, a privilege comparable to that of a priest being allowed to sit at the throne and learn directly from God. The point made, or the lesson completed, Richard abruptly announces he has to get back to Newport, jumps up, and hugs Deborah and Truffle goodbye, on the heels of which he rushes to me, leans in, and kisses me on the lips. A striking moment, I have to admit, because both of us, having grown up in seacoast towns in a certain era, have absorbed the unspoken rule that New England men should sooner kiss a lobster than each other. But that was the frozen past. I'm as moved by this ritual he's instigated as he's intent on observing it. Then he's gone, out to his car. For many years, a Model A Ford, and the 2-hour drive home. Truffle died nearly 4 years ago. Soon after we heard about Richard's death, I remarked to Deborah that with them, we'd lost the 2 purest beings we knew. Physical work was a great theme of Richard's life. It identified him to himself, it created him. Everything he understood, he learned by doing, which obviously, remembering his own father, he characterized in the last essay in his wonderful book, A Maritime Album, as a, quote, handing down of craft and understanding from parent to child, quote. Or he could also have written from artist to apprentice, or if the instructor was a practitioner, from teacher to student. From there, at least in him, those manual skills, honed by repetition, threaded through a mysterious bodily linkage from hand to mind, where they were transmuted into the systems and ideas that Richard used as frames for producing the objects of his we see around us in the gallery today. The same process, he would have argued, is that used by artists everywhere and forever. The very variety of this work demonstrates, I think, that Richard regarded each piece or invention or finding his way through the process of arriving at it provisional, a model for the next version, a tantalizing suggestion for something better or even radically different. Photography was the constant, but his methods for producing and presenting his pictures were always changing. His burning internal engine wouldn't allow him to rest, turning him away from the accomplished thing, then speeding him forward to the new one, which almost as predictably as his rush to it, he would soon announce to be the best one. And why not, when more than anyone in the world, he was the person responsible for imagining and giving a physical life to so many remarkable ways of accomplishing those things. Those of you who followed the many steps of his responses to digital photography, to take one example, will understand what I mean. For distinct from the charming deference he displayed in the corridors of the museums and institutions where he did his professional work, Richard, as I've already suggested, was immensely, even wildly sure of himself, as if, like a Homeric protagonist, he felt Athena or some other god hidden at his side, protecting him, leading him always in the true way. This certainty was shaped, it would seem, by growing up in a world where coming down for breakfast he might find Montgomery Clift or Thornton Wilder or Robert Flaherty sitting at the table chatting with his parents, or watch his father at a chessboard contesting the legendary Yale English professor William Wimsatt. A world then enlarged as a result of spending as his adult years around Walker Evans and Lincoln Kirstein and George Balanchine and Georgia O'Keeffe and John Tchaikovsky and Gary Winogrand and Lee Friedlander and the many other artist geniuses he worked with before turning to teaching. But as I write this, I remember him telling me about a Navy mate of his who used to say, "Benson, you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth," and his mother's epithet for him, "my little ray of sunshine." And I wonder, first, about those two remarks, and then about what I earlier called Richard's purity. For I think most of you would agree, at least here and now, that until June 22nd, when he died, the world could be divided into the somewhat undifferentiated mass of us, and there, apart, Richard Benson, an outlier, a singleton, who, as I bear down on this question, now seems to be never to have had to grow into or learn to be the person we knew, as if he had been born the great and generous spirit he was, and somehow understood as that spirit, that the more he burned away his energy for others, the more he would, like the sun his mother recognized in him, burn brighter as and for himself, thereby attracting others, so many others, into his orbit. Even as his knowledge and skill, the instruments of his power, increased. A circular generative process that, as I imagine him, bright as a new penny, humming with anticipation in the first light of a new day, must have been responsible for creating the excess part of the improbable share of happiness he was allotted, seemingly at birth. Not that he ever thought about happiness. He didn't have to, and neither did we when we were with him. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Gregory Crutzen, and I have to follow that. I first met Richard as an incoming student in 1986. Since then, I've known him as a teacher, a dean, a mentor, colleague, and friend. Throughout all that time, I always approached him with equal measures of respect and awe. He was a true genius, a master craftsman, and an intellectual giant. As in the case with all great geniuses, it was impossible to learn directly from his example in terms of technique and inherent skill. If asked to solve a technical problem, Richard would give a long response, draw charts, sketch complex diagrams, and we still wouldn't get it. The lesson he taught ultimately wasn't about solving the immediate problem, but was about a larger and more profound question. It was that the photographic print, the thing itself, matters. It means something. And each student, many of whom are in this room, had to discover their own particular relationship to the medium, thereby staying true to their individual story. Both Richard and his closest ally and friend, Todd, adhered to those guiding principles, and they formed the foundation of the photography program. We continue to follow in this tradition even as we expand the definition of lens-based picture making. Richard imparted in me and all his students a sense of reverence for the print, the craft of it, the precision and exactitude and discipline required of a photographer, and ultimately its power and legacy as a lasting physical object. In the current culture, where we encounter disposable images constantly and pervasively on screens and devices, it has become a greater challenge to maintain the authority and presence of the physical print. After his extraordinary tenure as dean, Richard went on to have something of a Renaissance period. Not only did he travel and photograph extensively, as well as write and publish numerous books, he continued the pursuit of his many other interests and obsessions, building steam engines and telescopes by hand, and proving a theory of how the pyramids were built. The commonality in all of these pursuits was the drive to understand how things worked. This brought him to what I find to be the most fascinating of all his explorations, clockmaking. He wanted to fashion a clock with the ability to maintain perfect time through the ages. He actually cut the gears himself, made the individual components, often using tools he developed. He wanted to understand every aspect of keeping time on a fundamental and abstract level. At some point, he became disinterested in the practical nature of a clock and dispensed with the vulgarity of the clock face. Richard, who was staunchly anti-conceptual and even bristled to be called an artist at times, made what could be considered the most perfect of conceptual artworks. A clock that could keep accurate time for 1,000,000 years and not be read. A beautiful paradox. The gifts that he left behind, the legacy of his prints, the constant and continuing keeper of time, all point to a sense of immortality. Even though Richard is no longer with us, we feel his presence through these physical objects of his creation. Thank you.
I think Jock will be happy to know I am keeping to time. One of my favorite memories of our Chip was his appearance upon entering his home in Newport for a visit. He materialized in the doorway like some strange and divine manifestation, shirtless, with what I recall to be a miner's helmet or something like that on, telling us we were welcome to come in for a minute, but then he sent us right back out to explore, while he was busy building some sort of giant fuel cell out of what I remember to be a huge block of car batteries all wired together. What it was powering, I couldn't remember. I'd like to imagine it was his mind. But Ben just told me that Chip told him he just liked to turn it on, hear it whir, and then turn it off. I loved the fact that this mentor of ours had limits and that he was not ready to visit with us until a certain amount of work was done for the day. This man did more in his life than most do in an entire lifetime, times 2, times 3. I just found this line from him in a 15-year-old email to reiterate that point. He said, "Glad you're busy. If you weren't, you would just be wasting your life like most of the world." So, and a few weeks before that material world lost Chip, my grandmother also passed away. And it gives me some measure of comfort when I look at our daughter and I know that some of her genetic material lives on inside this little person. And in much the same way, I look out here and I see Chip in all of you, in all of us. But only in the best parts of ourselves, when we are curious and obsessive as artists, and kind and generous as teachers, partners, parents, and people.
Chip's office door was always open to students, staff, and faculty when he was dean. I remember meeting with him one afternoon when I was a graduate student, and I happened to look up at the shelf near his desk, and I saw a phrase meticulously carved with 2 words: "Remember death." That small stone carried so much weight. It was a representation of the Benson family virtuosity and of the future that we all share together as mortal, ultimately fragile beings. Behind me, as I write this in this iteration of the School of Art, the house that Chip built, students debate the merits of a print in the darkroom. They're attempting to infuse a physical thing, a piece of photographic paper with meaning and a depth of communication that communicates something forceful and that may have a modicum of transcendence. A few of these students make errors and bring their prints unfixed and unready from the red-lit room and deliver them into the light of day where they fade to black. Remember death. I recall this often and understand why Chip placed it there, where he did. Viewable at any time of day with a passing eye. The etched lines of each letter communicating, remember to live fully and remember that we are beautifully impermanent. Do all we can while we are here and do it in the most righteous and decent way that we can possibly muster in this most imperfect world. What the stone couldn't do was to count the ways that others remember those that we lose. I refuse to use the past tense when considering Chip. I will continue to be in denial of his loss. He is just away, I will say to myself, and believe it. His voice is still so vivid, his presence still frantic and infectious. I will remember all of the generosity of my hero, how he was able to set limits when we tried to grasp at his coattails when he ran out the door to be with his family after class. We all so desired just a little more time with him. He was the best example that any of us could ever have as artists, experimenters, and just in being a damnably wonderful being. Chip, Barbara, and to all of the Benson family, you are beloved and owed so much gratitude for your patience by all that have passed through here, beyond all description. Thank you, and thank you to the stars and to the end of time. Remember, remember, remember our glorious Chip.
I just wanted to share these few words about Chip on behalf of my fellow classmates, some of whom I know are here, some of whom I know aren't. But I speak on behalf of my classmates from the class of 1993. As I mentioned to a friend in the lobby as I was coming in, this is one of those occasions you hope you'll never be at, and yet when the moment comes, you know you wouldn't be anywhere else. All of us who knew Chip knew that when we were in his presence, we were indeed in the presence of someone special. It wasn't just his overall brilliance, the fact that here was a man who seemingly could make anything, build anything from the ground up, no matter how seemingly ordinary or insanely complex. If you knew anything about him, you already knew that about Richard Benson. His reputation preceded him in that way. What one could not necessarily know until meeting him was that aside from that extraordinary brain in his head, the man exuded a deep and profound humanity. Indeed, the man's heart felt as deep as his brain was expansive. Both were considerable and could have been formidable in an intimidating way had those tendencies existed in a different kind of person. Instead, Chip convinced you that these impressive skills simply sprang forth from an innate curiosity seeking a solution to a particular challenge. Never mind that most of us would have simply shaken our head at some of those challenges and found a pleasurable path of less resistance. I grew up with an engineer father, a man who had a tool for every task imaginable, those at hand and those that might arise in the future. He routinely convinced me I could do things I thought I had no capacity for whatsoever. So Chip was not a completely foreign breed to me when I met him at my admissions interview. I immediately took a liking to Chip that first day before I was in the program, and it soon became apparent as the interview and conversation unfolded that it was mutual. For 2 years after that, I marveled at the pearls of observational wisdom that routinely tumbled out of his mouth. He seemed able to zero in on the most pertinent aspect of one's work, crawl into your brain, call out your intentions, and then gently but firmly nudge you to ask yourself the questions that would move your work forward if you gave them serious consideration. The whole time, you were aware that while you may have ultimately been the one to answer the questions, it was the brilliant man in the red suspenders who knew what questions to ask in the first place. One of the things I have been telling my students for years is something that I distilled from my conversations with Chip, and that is this. As artists, we think by making things. One doesn't figure the thing out and then make it. The act of making is the thinking that becomes the physical object. I kind of knew this, but Chip made it more resolute, and it has become something of a dictum with me, the thing I tell my students to remember if they don't remember anything else I ever tell them. All of us who knew Chip came to love him dearly, whether we saw him frequently or infrequently. His presence kept our compasses pointing in the right direction, a direction of rigor and integrity, continually asking the tough questions and then making the work and more work and more work in response. On my better days as an artist and teacher, I've tried to channel and embody his enthusiasms and brilliance, knowing full well that I'll never be anywhere near as prodigious, but knowing also that I will always get to a place beyond the ordinary if I continue to follow his example. And in closing, I just want to say an affirmative phrase that the Yorubas always close with, and that my professor here at Yale, Robert Ferris Thompson, always closes with as well. And that word is ashe. And so it is, and so it shall be. Thank you.
I'm John Gamble, and I'm what they call in the Murray family an outlaw. I'm Barbara Murray's brother-in-law, and Chip and I were sort of in-laws in-law. It's been so wonderful to listen to what people have had to say, and I will never forget much of what I've just heard, because it so strongly communicates an experience of Chip that I think we've all got a piece of, but can never and totally encompass in anything that we might say. When Chip introduced me, he used to say, "Grumble and I are married to a pair of sisters." Sisters, Barbara Murray Benson and Martha Murray, my wife. Grumble was my college nickname, and Chip loved it. When I protested that I found his public use of it embarrassing, that just egged him on. But the truth is, I was flattered to be among the nickname people he liked and teased. I met Barbara and Chip when I was 20. They drove up to Middlebury College to introduce Martha and me to their beautiful, serious infant daughter, Sarah. Poozle, they called her. That lovely meeting was the first and probably the last time I didn't cut away from the conversation to trap Chip in a technical discussion. Tech talk, Martha Murray says, rolling her eyes. Sharing interests in pictures, boats, printing, and mechanics, I was immediately enthralled by Chip. By the time I was 25, I wanted to be Chip. Out of luck there. But while I couldn't be Chip, he generously and repeatedly helped me to find and build parts of who I am to do what I wanted to do. He did this by lesson and example, and he also gave me objects, jobs, and support all along the way. He gave me a letterpress and a pile of handmade paper when I was still in college. Working through Martha, he got me to propose marriage to her in such a way that she was totally surprised when I did. That's another story for later. He gave me a view camera and taught me how to use it, nominally. He almost surely talked Alvin Eisenman into admitting me into Yale's graphic design program. He involved me in a score of printing and design projects, among the one on the screen, that gave me the skills I use daily in my work. And he supported my application to my current job as university printer, which I love. All this, and I never gathered myself up to thank him thoroughly and say goodbye to him before he died. My last conversation with Chip took place over the phone in the spring. I couldn't figure out a good way to ground an electrical circuit I was working on in our little cabin in Vermont. Of course, he pictured exactly what I was asking about and set me on the right track. I signed off with the usual sincere thank you for his help, but that was it. So now I'm having a hard time taking to ground my connection to Chip, my feelings of deepest gratitude, admiration, and loss. But it's a constant consolation being here with all of you, people whom Chip loved, teased, and taught. I can imagine Chip's frustration with me now that I'm bringing this to an end. He would call out in his stage whisper, "For God's sake, Grumble, you've said what you want to say, now sit down." Thank you, Chip.
A lot of people here. In 1970, in 69, I, with Jim Dine, did a portfolio which gave Maria and I some extra money. And in 1970, I decided we should spend it on a book. We should spend it on a book that nobody's going to do. So my self-portrait book. And I was sent to Meriden Gravure in Connecticut to John Peckham, who said, give him a tour. I'm not quite ready for him. So I got a tour of Meriden Gravure, and I met Richard. And he seemed to be the only person there that I was comfortable with quickly. And I came back, and John Peckham gave me an estimate and a program. And when he was talking to me, he at once said, "Your book is oblong." And it wasn't a very pretty word. I thought maybe he was criticizing the book, but I wasn't sure. So when we agreed upon terms and time, I asked his secretary, I said, "Where's the kid who makes halftones at?" And she pointed me. And I found Richard, and I said, "Could you tell me what oblong means?" And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, the guy in the office said, your book is oblong," and it didn't sound good to me. And Richard started laughing. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "It's simple. It means horizontal." And I started laughing. I said, "What's vertical?" And he said, "Upright." I said, "My book's not upright either." So. Anyway, we kind of became friends and went out and had a steamed hamburger, which I think only exists in Meriden, Connecticut. That was actually quite good. Let's see. We did many books after that. One of them was The American Monument, which Richard and Leslie Katz and I spent about a year figuring out. It was before computers and before automatic machines. I think we made pages with just cardboard cutouts without pictures on them. We indicated the pictures. It took a long time. Let's see. Anyway, we did during the book. Some of the things somebody else has said here, or one of you said, we did a test. Richard did one on coated paper and one on soft paper, and he wanted the one on soft paper, and I said, "Richard, the coated paper looks a little bit better, maybe." He said, "Oh no, the trouble of the world is coated paper." As you all know, that was the end of the conversation. We became good friends, and according to my contact sheets, we made 16 trips together around the country, mostly to the west, a couple to the south and one to the north, where John Tchaikovsky had a cousin. We traveled, 7 of the trips were with John Childs and John Tchaikovsky. Let's see. We had great times there. The other thing that was funny was we both had morning drinks that we liked. I drank green tea and Richard made coffee, which he kept saying, "Coffee, coffee, coffee." Right, Abby? And I thought he was a real connoisseur of coffee. Because, in a motel room, we had immersion heaters, and Richard made a big fuss about it. It was only after about 15 trips that I realized he put about 6 sugars and 2 or 3 phony creamers in it. And I didn't know. Well, as somebody else said, he could do anything. He made clocks. I saw the clocks too. They were amazing. I think he could make a car if he wanted to. In the last few years, we both had serious medical problems, and we decided to speak to each other on the phone at 6 a.m. every morning. We didn't have a hell of a lot to say, really, but we stayed on the phone long enough till one of us made both of us laugh. And that was a treat for me, certainly. After Maria, he was my best friend.
My first memory of Benson was also at Meriden in about 1980 when he was printing Aceh for MoMA. I'd never met anyone remotely like this wild-haired, nonstop talker with his split lip and his jaunty gait who was so cheerfully in charge. And for lunch, I'd like to pick up on Lee's remark. Benson took us to Ted's. And it was a joint that was world famous for cheeseburgers. They were special. They were cooking in little coffins that were suspended in a little glass cage on the counter, and they were kind of slippery and grayish and rectangular. As a Texan, I was dubious that I was going to enjoy this steamed cheeseburger, but as everyone here knows, Benson's enthusiasm was absolutely infectious, and within minutes I found myself not only marveling at this novelty, the little contraption and everything, I was, like all of us here, falling in love with Chip's brain, his energy, and his certainty that he was making the world better, one great photography book at a time. With every project, Benson reinvented his techniques and fine-tuned them to make reproductions ever more accurate and convincing in a book. We thought he'd reached the summit with the latest, whatever it was, in this case it was Aceh, but he was secretly dissatisfied. He was always walking a tightrope between his personal best and his desire for better yet. And he worked in an agony of terror and faith that the calculations and intuitions he was shepherding through the press would turn out glorious in the end. One evening over a beer, Benson told me that the root problem, what was the root problem before, John? I can't remember. Coated paper, that was it. No, this time the root problem of modern life was the assembly line. Machines were no longer made and run by one mind, one clear through line of effort. And the craftsmen responsible for the various steps, and not just the craftsmen, but the production people and everyone else, they were not involved ultimately in the whole thing or the aesthetics of the outcome. And what he wanted was to make a book the way a painter or a stone carver creates a work of art, by mind and hand and effort. And he wanted a steady patron with a deep pocket, for he had been working concertedly with an exquisitely demanding Doris Bree toward mastering the art of printing Stieglitz photographs on uncoated paper, that soft paper, when all of a sudden, Georgia O'Keeffe switched advisors, requiring him to bail. Luckily, Pierre Praxine was just then looking to make a catalog of the Gilman Paper Company's collection, of which he was the curator. He and Howard Gilman were pondering how they could make a book of uncompromising quality that would embody the uniqueness and rarity of their collection, which covered the 19th century and first half of the 20th, with an array of images of acutely different size, shape, surface, color, and complexion. Doris Bree, now O'Keeffe's former assistant, and Leslie Katz of the very fine Aikens Press suggested they meet Richard Benson. And he proposed reproducing each photograph by itself singly, with one image per sheet. He could choose appropriately matte or glossy paper and mix inks specific to each image. The paper could pass through the press many times, and the superimposed impressions, 4, 5, even 6, would assemble an accumulation of tints and tones that would replicate the body, weight, color, and texture of the originals. The finished sheets would need to be trimmed and tipped on by hand, which created this bulging monster to bind, but fine craftsmen could still be found in Italy where this whale of a book could be assembled. To envision such an implausible volume would require buying a press, installing it in Benson's house, which actually had to be enlarged to contain it, tuning the press, training an assistant, buying years of life of this brilliant artist and his helper. Benson convinced Gilman to sponsor this moonshot. Without any doubt, they were going for broke. I think almost literally. They had to ship all this paper from Italy and back and forth. It was really crazy. A folly, to be sure. After nearly 5 years of work, the mammoth book was finished. 1,200 copies with 200 plates in each and every one hand-printed by Benson and Thomas Palmer. No laser scanners or computers were involved, Benson proudly noted, for these modern tools interfered with the function of the eye, the mind, and the hand. Of course, he would go on to embrace those very tools with the same delirious joy that consumed him when pushing offset lithography to its furthest capacities. His nearly 20-year pursuit of that goal, culminating in the Gilman book in 1985, earned him a MacArthur Fellowship the following year. So thank you.
So a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm done. I can't do that. No, I never got a pig hat. It's the sadness of my life. I'm going to have to read so I don't fall apart. First of all, no ideas but in things. With all due respect to William Carlos Williams, he didn't know the half of it. Dominic and I moved to Newport 35 years ago when Chip and Barbara hired me to work on the Gilman book. After a year in a small apartment, we bought a house directly behind theirs, and we have lived within a block or two of them ever since. I figured if you're going to spend your life working in someone else's shadow, you might as well do it literally and enjoy the company. Jock suggested that I might have an anecdote or two to share. I have a number, but then we all have our own Chip stories, our own Benson stories. Each one of them is unique, and yet they are all very similar. They are all usually about a man and a vision. And they are often about a man and a vision and a very heavy piece of machinery. So one of my stories is about steam engines, and I'd like you all to keep that video in mind that we saw at the beginning of the program. In 1985, we were finishing printing the Gilman book, and terror had given way to accomplishment, and we were both moving on to other projects. Chip was exploring making photographs in ink on the press or in acrylic paint on aluminum, and also increasing the efficiency of the steam engine. I was finishing the gravure printing of Oh Write My Name for Leslie Katz, and also creating Steam Feet, a ballet in 2 acts for dancers, strings, and steam engines. Partly inspired by the rhythm of the printing press, Steam Feet was the logical, creative outcome of the previous 4 years of my life. The Island Moving Company provided the dancers, Jim Bennett and Fudd Benson the strings, and Chip and Daniel the steam. As it turned out, the steam engines required the most intricate choreography. Though the state boiler inspector plumbing inspector, and fire marshal had all individually approved the steam engines early on, they collectively decided to deny permission for the show 1 week before the scheduled opening. This necessitated an elaborate Bensonian dance of expertise and enthusiasm that thoroughly and successfully charmed the jaded bureaucrats into reversing their position, allowing the show to go on. The first act was a fairly tame modern dance set to can music. The steam engines were the centerpiece of the second act, backed up by Jim and Fudd. Just outside of the rear entrance of the theater sat a large cast iron boiler from which hoses snaked through the wings and under the toe shoes of the dancers to the two engines, one large, one small, sitting in the center of the stage. During intermission, while the dancers changed and rested, Chip and Daniel got steam up, oiled the beasts, and prepared for mayhem. The curtain went up, revealing the engines pumping away, Daniel and Chip jumping about as they tended them. And over the next 15 minutes, the pace of the engines and their operators and the dancers and the strings gradually increased until they reached a spitting, steaming, whistling, whirling crescendo of post-apocalyptic chaos, ending only as the curtain fell on the last wheeze of the dying engines. Chip was totally into this. He was totally into the steam engines on the stage and the dancers. So, not long after the original Newport performance, Rhode Island College offered to put the piece on in Providence. Chip was cajoled, and the steam engines were trailered up to Roberts Hall, and the boiler positioned and filled and fired up. The afternoon dress rehearsal went off without a hitch, and everyone was preparing for the evening show when the theater was plunged into complete darkness. And there's nothing darker than a theater without lights. Panic. And then the slow realization that the show might not go on. A bolt of lightning had hit the theater's transformer. The theater was completely without power. Frantic efforts were made. Preposterous solutions were suggested. And by the time the audience began to arrive, our last best hope had just fallen through. For while the cast and crew had been praying for a miracle, Chip had been quietly working through possible solutions. Half an hour before curtain, he concluded that the steam engines could power either the house lights or the stage lights, but not both. And although they were impressed with the effort, the college decided that for safety reasons, the show had to be canceled. The steam engines were packed up, never to grace the stage again. Over the years, Chip and I worked on other less outlandish projects, and Dominique and I still live down the block from Barbara. But I've given up waiting for the phone to ring and for Chip to say, "Palmer, have you got a minute? You've got to come down and see this. I've finally figured it out."
In the printed picture exhibition at MoMA in 2008, the series of works of art were in standard frames. Well, Richard's scruffy examples of this or that technique were under pieces of plexi held to the wall by L brackets. The art handlers had to screw the brackets into the wall by hand, and there were lots of them. So when Richard went home for the weekend, he made a drill bit so the guys could drive the L brackets into the wall with their electric drills. It was, and still is, I'm sure, the only time that the curator of a show at MoMA invented and manufactured a tool to hang it. As many of you know, Richard developed the printed picture by using those scraps of paper in lectures to small groups so everyone could see what he was talking about. After one lecture to a group at MoMA, someone asked, "How long would it take me to learn how to do what you do. Richard thought about it a minute. You could tell he was thinking about it. And then he said, it would take me a month to teach you, and then you'd have to do it every day for 20 or 30 years. Many of you also know, because Richard explained it so well, that notwithstanding the great Gilman book, he couldn't have made his photomechanical revolution without the expensive offset presses that had been designed for fancy color advertising. The hard part was making the separations, which could then be printed on any number of presses. This put Benson in the position of a besserwisser waltzing onto an unfamiliar floor, telling highly skilled pressmen how to do their jobs. It really was something to watch Richard work with these guys, charm them, teach them, befriend them all at once. I have a really stupid idea, he'd say. I'm sure it won't work. But maybe we'll learn something from the mess. Do you want to try it? You bet they did. Those guys were lucky to have Richard walk onto their floor. And recently I've been reckoning how incredibly lucky the whole photography world was too. He could have done anything he wanted, and just think of how many things intrigued him. The construction of the pyramids, for example. In 1970, when Richard was working on Friedlander's self-portrait, if he hadn't sensed that pretty soon he could turn those dog shit duotones into Leslie Katz's velvety black butterfly wings and Richard's own lay this laurel, I doubt he would have stuck around much longer. He would have gone on to make telescopes or computers or spaceships or something we don't have a name for yet. We were lucky to have life with Richard, with his unique creative mind and all of his wit and humor and generosity and warmth and kindness, because he came along just when photography needed him most.
Well, needless to say, I am not Deborah Burke, the recently appointed Dean of the Yale School of Architecture. Something came up in Deborah's family that's prevented her from being here today, but she asked that I read two things to you. The first thing she wanted me to read to you was a letter she wrote to Chip on April 21st, 2006, which was the time that marked the end of his 10-year deanship of the Yale School of Art. She wrote, "Dear Chip, I've kept on my desk for a few weeks now the announcement from President Richard Levin about your retirement. It's been a reminder to write, but has also prompted many fond memories of working with you. I have had the good fortune of working with many intelligent and passionate people in my career, and you rank at the very top of that list. Working with you on the design of the art school was fun, parentheses, most of the time, educational all of the time, and very fulfilling. I had the privilege of enjoying your wonderful sense of humor and witnessing your remarkable ability to lead. You did wonderful things for all the artists at Yale. I wish you all the best in your retirement. I hope you get plenty of time in boats, time with clocks, time to make photographs, and time with your wonderful family. I am a very lucky woman in many ways, and working with you is definitely one of them. With great affection and respect, Deborah." Most recently, she wrote, "Dear Jock, Barbara, members of the Benson family and Yale colleagues and former students of Chip's. I am sorry I'm not with you here today to remember and celebrate one of my favorite people in the whole world, Chip Benson. As I'm sure has been said by other speakers today, Chip was a thoughtful, brilliant artist, A stunning still photograph of his, appropriately enough taken from a porch in Newport, Rhode Island, hangs in my own home. I love it for its crisp serenity because it brings Chip to mind. It is a good image to start each day with. Yankee clarity, no pretension. Among the Yale faculty, Chip's time as Dean of the Yale School of Art is recalled with great fondness. Amongst the architecture faculty in the then named A&A building, his office was kitty corner from ours. And we were not only fond, but also jealous. He was the coolest dean on campus. All the more cool because he didn't give a hoot about being cool at all. With that, his open and engaging nature had a great impact on the institution he clearly loved. His generosity and insight helped shape the future of the arts end of campus when he came up with the idea that the architecture school could, quote, camp out in the new sculpture building for a year before the art school moved in to allow Rudolph Hall to be renovated and added to. It was a completely brilliant idea and saved the university over $20 million. As the dean of the architecture school now, I can honestly say that we really miss the artist. But as an architect, I was lucky enough to work with Chip on the design of what is now the Yale School of Art. Chip was a visionary, and it became evident that his ideal project involved us architects not really doing anything. He very kindly and very gently expressed a concern that our work would be too polished and perfect for his preferences. At one point, he even suggested we could best meet Yale's modest construction budget and his own "we make art here" aesthetic by arranging to have delivered to him a very large stack of 2x4s so he could mess around, essentially taking care of it without the constraint of architects. Contractors, Yale's facilities management, or damned building codes. And he didn't seem to be kidding. We ended up giving him a little bit more than a bunch of planks, but our work was vastly improved by the chance to collaborate with such a clear thinker, an insightful critic, and someone of artistic and technical mastery. He made us better. I know we're not alone in appreciating and now very much missing Chip's capacity to share, teach, and create with love. Godspeed, my Rhode Island friend, Deborah. Thank you. I want to follow up my remarks on something Daniel talked about, how momentous it was when his father got the call from Richard Levin to be offered the deanship, because it really did mark a tremendous shift in the Benson family's life. Many of you may not know that at that time, Chip felt it was important that he literally move here to New Haven, where along with Sheila de Bretteville, with Todd, with Jessica Stocker, the others, that he would live here full time. As Daniel said, he was going to be all in on this job. And they came and bought a house on Pearl Street. I'll get to that a little later. But I too got a call from Rick Levin in 1998. Chip had already been dean for 2 years, and when Levin hired me, he said, one of the first things you need to do is go over and see Richard Benson. I know you know about him already, but he's already asked that you be appointed an adjunct professor in the photography department at his school, and he's very eager to meet you. I said, I'm eager to meet him. I came over to the school. Chip took one look at me. He said, Reynolds, you look just like my brother Tom. You're tall, you're red-faced, you're a little overweight, and he died of a heart attack. You better take better care of yourself. And by the way, you're invited to dinner at my house with my wonderful wife, Barbara, who I want you to meet. So I think maybe a day later, I went over to Pearl Street, walked in the front door, and there in the living room, I saw 5 clocks, none of which had faces on them, have been mentioned. I said, what are these things? He said, well, this is something I make. And I said, well, can you tell me how you came to make these things? Oh, yes, I'll do that. But first, Barbara has a really wonderful meal for us, and that's the most important thing to do. Let's sit down and have a great meal. And then at dessert time, we'll talk about these devices. We did have an incredible meal. Many of you have been treated to Barbara's wonderful meals, the great lobster party feast that she sponsored for so many student gatherings in Newport and here. And it was right then I could see that the two of them as a couple was something really special. They had come here together. And many of you may not know it, Barbara immediately engaged herself in the community every year doing the major crafts fair, which was one of the greatest fundraisers for the Creative Arts Workshop here in New Haven. And she took a very active role in the community of this city, just as she and Chip have all their lives in Newport. That 10 years was very special for all of us. So finally, after this great dinner we had, I said, well, okay, you're going to show me now how you make these things? And he said, yeah, come down in the basement with me. I walked down the stairs. There was a complete, and I mean complete machine shop down there. Drill presses, lathes, everything you can imagine. And no evidence of any drawings of clocks, no description of how these were made. There were a lot of little Post-its on the wall. And I said, well, how do you make these things? And I said, well, I think about how to put them together, and I cut gears, and I make parts, and I put them together. I said, you did, really? And he said, yeah, that's what I do. I said, well, now the other question, how the hell did you ever get all this stuff down in the basement here? Daniel Benson, my son, he's a behemoth and he's strong, and he helped me. So, that 10 years for all of us who knew Chip, we've all talked about him today. His remarkable commitment to sharing what he knew, his love of family, his love of teaching, his love of making things was just profound in our life. He befriended everyone who showed an interest in what he knew. There are many of you in this audience, some of whom never even went to Yale, but if you ran into him and said you were interested in photography, he'd become your teacher. He was that kind of person. If he's evidenced a sense that someone was interested in the knowledge he had, was willing to pursue things with a sense of, diligent work, he'd be right there with you. That's been spoken of many, many times. So we're now going to end this program, and we're then going to go off and have some wonderful reception, food and drink, and there's work of Chip's throughout the museum and the lobby and the American galleries upstairs in the print room. But I want to end this program with two short videos. One that's, of course, entirely appropriate, given how often the clocks have been talked about. And one is sort of a declaration. It's been mentioned, Chip so often declared to us the kind of things we should be thinking about doing with our time and our lives. And then we're going to end with a remarkable, both those videos, by the way, are made by John Pilson, another wonderful student of Chip's, who's here with us. And then we're going to end with a remarkable time-lapse video that is Chip's dear friend Alan Chasnoff made of the sign-offs that they had with each other, the final image each time they signed off from their early morning video chaps over the last year. And when that ends, you can all leave the auditorium and let's spend the rest of the afternoon sharing more stories and anecdotes together. So we're ready for those videos now. Thank you.
You should realize that the thing that is interesting is not you, it's what you make. You've got to understand it. And that means the more time you spend on it, the less interesting it is. Because the more you're coming in and intruding on the thing out in the world that was what made the picture interesting, or you're intruding on the moment when the picture was made, or something about the picture that has made it good. But people have this idea, young people, I'm sorry, have this idea that the reason their art is interesting is because of them. And that's not true. That's not true. And in fact, nobody cares about you. And if I put pictures on the wall, nobody gives a shit about me. They're interested in the thing I put on the wall, right? So you have to get really clear-headed about it. And one of the ways you solve this problem is you do a lot of work. And if you do a lot of work, you end up not being able to wreck it by spending too much time on it. And you can look back and look at a huge mass of stuff and find out what it is that you've done. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that. Does that make sense? So this is a clock that most clocks, the pendulum is pushed every time it swings. But this is a clock where there's a feedback loop. And this mechanism in here measures how far the swing is, and it only pushes it when it needs it. So it's not pushing it now, but in a minute it'll do it. Just wait. There. See, and it pushes it. Now it won't have to push it for maybe 5 or 6 minutes. Yeah, it figures it out.
But for that 1 second, is it off? Is it like too fast?
No, but it's a good question. What happens is it's faster, slower, then hits it faster, slower,
Right,
slower.
okay.
So if you plotted it, it would be like this.
Yeah.
Whereas most clocks are like this, but they drift. And they go off, but this is made so that it doesn't go off. So it's doing this, but it's in the right place.
Right.
And most clocks are driven by the weight. And this isn't driven by the weight. The weight is underneath there. But what the weight does is it resets that weight, and that little weight pushes it. So that no gear train is pushing it. So it's the same every time. There it is again.
How about that?
It's pretty cool, isn't it? Does that fuck it up?
No, that helps. Did you machine all the parts?
Yeah,
Yes,
I
you
made them all
did.
here. These are store-bought gears, but this is all gears I made.
Well, like the weights, did you count those, or was that not things that you had?
These I just grabbed. I just found in different places. And then this is a piece of invar, which is it's a metal that was invented for standing meter, and it doesn't change length no matter what the temperature changes. And that stuff costs $100 an inch, and I found this piece at Yale. I bought 3 pieces 8 feet long for $100. They were in the lab at Yale. Okay, yeah, you've all been very good at looking at my clock. I'll shut the lights off now.
Imagine me and you, I do. I think about you day and night. It's only right to think about the girl you love and hold her tight. So happy together. If I should call you up, invest a dime, and you say you belong to me and ease my mind. Imagine how the world could be so very fine, so happy together. Toss the dice, it had to be. The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together. I can't see me loving nobody but you for all my life. When you're with me, baby, the skies will be blue for all my life. Me and you, and you and me, no matter how they toss the dice, it had to be. The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together.